particularly when you want to start doing proper SO2 management, because we're talking 1/10 is the difference between, we won't go into that, but the paper strips, they're weighing in like 25-pound increments, but to do what we want to do effectively, we need to be able to measure single-pound increments, and that's why those strips don't really help when you need to know what your pH is of your must. And so why we're talking now about pH, and we talked about mead stalling or getting stinky because of pH. Some people are of the mind that you want to add potassium bicarbonate up front every time you make a mead. I disagree with that. You can if you want to, and I know people do, and that's totally fine. I'm all good with that. I don't feel you need to unless it's necessary. In other words, don't add a bunch of stuff unless it needs it. Peter taught me that. I also know that a lot of people say, well, mead's going to stall if it gets below 3.2 or 3.4. Most of that's BS, too, because I've had tons of meads that go to 3 or less and still don't stall because of pH issues.
They may not smell great, though.
EC 11118, anybody? That'll power through anything. Shoot, you could put vinegar in there and it'd probably ferment that.
Right. So what I'm here to say, people, is for $15 you can buy a cheap pH meter, and it's going to really serve your purpose when you need to have it. And it's just something that I've always measured when I make my must, and then I measure it a couple days after my fermentation starts, and then I measure it at the end of my growth phase. And then you also need to know what your pH is when you stabilize, because your SO2 additions are all based on a pH level. And so if you don't know what your pH is, you have no idea how much sulfites you're supposed to be adding to stabilize your mead.
And if you
stabilize
sulfate, it's going to blow up, and if you over sulfate, it's going to leave off flavors. So yeah, you need.
That's right. That's right. Although it's really pretty hard to over sulfite unless you just really make blaring blunders, like you're using tablespoons instead of teaspoons, or
it's been done.
It's been done.
Yeah. Right.
I'm not sure there was enough splash racking in the world to fix that one.
Yeah, well, and that's what you get for
tried, but
you got to not taste so much when you're trying to finish your meal.
Yeah, if it makes you feel better, I double sulfited 16 gallons of the best strawberry mead I've ever made in my life.
Dude, did you have
and I ruined it all. I'm sorry?
Did you have to dump it?
I tried adding like 20 pounds of strawberries per gallon to get it right, and it still never tasted that good. So some of it I made sort of drinkable. The other I still have, and I use it as a sulfite addition. If what I'm making doesn't mind a little bit of a strawberry note to it. But basically, when you over sulfite, you pretty much destroy your flavor profile anyway, and so you probably wouldn't even be able to know it's strawberry in there unless you have a really good palate.
Yeah.
But
it can do a number on the color too.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, bleaches it out to where you can't tell it was strawberries by looking at it either.
Yep.
So here's the point I want to make sure that people understand, because this is critical. I don't want people to get upset because they misunderstood what I said about we're going back now to racking timing, and also what you need to do in advance so that you can avoid the off flavors that people so paranoidly, is that a word, try to avoid, and they make mistakes because they're trying to avoid issues that can be negated through other means. If you have a stinky batch, I don't want you to leave your must on your lees. If you've had some sulfur issues when your fermentation is over, then cold crash it, or if you want to use some fining agents, and I actually do both at the same time. I save a lot of racking losses. I will generally rouse my lees for a month or even more. Now, if I have mellow mills, and if you don't use a bag, or even sometimes when you do use a bag, you still get a lot of heavy fruit pieces down in the bottom. those can go vegetal on you if you leave them in there for too long. But if you're practicing temperature control like we're advocating, leaving some of that leaving some of your fruit pieces in the bottom of your must, if it's 15, 14, 16% alcohol, that's going to act as a preservant to some degree. And if it's at 65 degrees or 60, that's also being refrigerated, and so you don't have to necessarily be overly cautious about that. But if you're leaving it at room temperature and you have a bunch of fruit bits in it, I wouldn't leave it in there quite so long, or at least I would pay closer attention to it. And or if you had a stinky batch, those are probably the two times when I would say you're safer to get off the lees than leaving the lees in there. But if you have a clean fermentation and you're practicing temp control and you haven't had any issues, you're going to benefit by keeping your lees roused up in your must for, I generally wait anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks before I'll rack my stuff off. And so that's when you should rack, in my opinion. The longer you leave it, the better, providing everything is clean and kept at good temperature and you've practiced good sanitation, all the things that are just common sense. Some people have the idea that you can stop a fermentation in progress by sulfiting and sorbating.
Nope.
Most of the time, nope. Especially not if it's still early in, even if it's in the middle of the stationary phase. I don't think you stand a very good chance. If you want to try that, you can, but I'm telling you that you might be subjecting yourself to some off flavors by stressing out your yeast and not killing them. So here's my recommendation. I like to, personally, I don't really care what my alcohol content is enough that I gotta know by some scientific measurement, or, if it's 14 or 15 or 13 and a half, who gives a rat's ass? That's close enough for me. So I don't really care that much. But here's what I generally do. I like to add enough gravity so that when my yeast have eaten all of what I expect them to eat, they run out of food at the same time that they hit their alcohol tolerance level. I find that when they don't have any more food in their must, there's no more sugar, there's no more nutrients, and they're at that place where they are close to tapping out or they do tap out, that's then generally a very easy time to arrest the fermentation by doing two things at once. And I do this so that I eliminate some racking losses. Most of the time anymore, I will run my yeast until they tap out or they run out of sugar. Then I'll keep my lees in suspension for a month. And you'll be surprised, at that month period of time, when you stop stirring them, within 2 days, you've got a boatload of stuff that's already dropped out to the bottom. But if you waited 2 days a month ago, almost nothing would have fallen out.
That's interesting.
And so that binding goes on where all those strands of molecular stuff bind together, and their molecular weight becomes enough that it causes them to drop out right away. Now, what I also do then is I'll sulfite and sorbate at the same time, although I do it 24 hours different. I add my sulfites first, and then 24 hours later I add my sorbate. But at the same time, I'll stop stirring, and I'll put my stuff in a cold crashing phase. Either I've got a controllable stainless steel fermenter now, where I can control the temperatures, based on heating and cooling unit that's built right into my fermenter. But before that, when it was time, I would add my sulfites and sorbates, and then I would put it in the refrigerator and cold crash it. Now, some people would say, well, are you really going to be able to sulfite well enough with all that crap in there? Well, the fact of the matter is, the answer is no. But the same answer would be no if they stopped stirring or never stirred at all, and they racked it off and then added the quarter teaspoon for 6 gallons of sulfite. You still don't get enough sulfites in there to stabilize your mead. because when we add sulfites, they bind to different particles, different solids. Every must is different. But if you add, say, 60 parts per million of sulfite to stabilize your batch, more than half of that generally gets bound up. And I know this because of the analyzer. I can measure what they call free SO2, SO2 that has not bound up to other ingredients inside the must, and it's the free SO2 that actually is the available units that can attack oxygenation and microorganisms. And so when I add my sulfite and sorbate and cold crash and then rack it off, I've basically saved myself 2 racking losses by doing that all at the same time. And we're going to talk much more in depth about sulfiting later. But let's just say you made a traditional, and it's really a pretty clean mead. There's nothing in there but honey, yeast, and water, but you will have a bunch of yeast at the bottom, and you'll still have some proteins. You might still have some honey based on your residual sugars left over, your final gravity. If you add 50 parts per million of sulfite in there, 20, 25, maybe even 30 parts of that will bind in that traditional, so those are no longer effective. So the point that I'm trying to say is too many times people think, well, yeah, I added my fourth of a teaspoon into my 5-gallon carboy, so now I've got the correct sulfite addition that I need to be what they call stable. Mm-hmm. And you really don't. You have only probably about half of that. And depending on your pH,
could be less.
The higher pH you have, the more sulfites you need. And so if you have a high pH must to start with, and you added the 50, you might only be ending up with 10 that are free at the end of the day, 2 days later, that could actually do anything. And so you really don't have very many soldiers in there that can attack the microorganisms if they get in somehow. And
that's admittedly rare, though. I don't think I've had maybe one batch go sideways, and it wasn't an infection. It was wild yeast making it weird. In one of my open top ferments. But yeah,
right. I mean, well, the sulfites would stop the wild yeast from going crooked.
Oh yeah, totally. But they're not going to keep it from spoiling, though, if you store it improperly or whatever.
Well, a lot of people have problems, and I'm here to say it's because they don't understand what it takes to truly do sulfite additions. It's not something you can be done once and be done, and it's a continual process that you need to monitor, and you really need to at least have a pH meter, and then go by some semi-predictable science to a small degree. But if you really want to do it right, you need to be able to measure your free SO2, and you can do that for relatively cheap. Like, I think some of the titratable units cost $2 per time you want to test, or you can spend anywhere between $400 and $1,000 to buy an analyzer that will test that plus a whole bunch of other things as well. But so my point is, people too often think, well, I stabilized, which means that I shouldn't ever have a restarting fermentation, and I shouldn't ever get sick with bad guys, with bugs. And yet then later on we hear about fermentations that started back up, or I grew vinegar in my batch, or I've got a pellicel growing on the top. What is this white slimy looking stuff with roots that hang down into my mead? Those are all things that happen when you don't do your sulfites correctly and you really haven't stabilized your mead. And tonight's not the night to talk about that, other than just to make people aware that there's a lot more to it than just adding a quarter teaspoon to your 5-gallon carboy and considering it good. One of the things I wanted to make people aware of, this is a very misunderstood concept. People think when they have fermented their fermentation to a point that they think that their alcohol has died, with quotes around them, my yeast are dead now because they died of alcohol poisoning.
Nope.
People
they're just passed out.
Plain, they don't die of alcohol poisoning. But you're right. They just cannot. They cannot assimilate.